Secretary Linda McMahon announced what she called the final mission for the federal Department of Education. It's the first step toward a plan to close the department, and in McMahon's words, to also end the overreach from Washington. The department has been in operation since 1980, and so Tara, are we comfortable with this? What are the potential ramifications for upstate school districts and parents were this to actually happen?
Probably the biggest ramification is what happens to the oversight and the funding for specific components of what the Department of Education does. For example, the Title I funds that go to districts with large numbers of low-income students. What happens to the funding for the school lunch programs, which are pretty much funded by the federal government? So that's the biggest question, I think, for upstate schools is, does the state absorb that cost if those programs aren't shifted? For example, there's been talk of shifting some of those programs to the Department of Commerce, et cetera. So does the state absorb those costs? And if the state does decide to absorb those costs, if the federal government doesn't continue to provide that funding, then what does that in turn mean? That we're going to have to pay higher property taxes, et cetera?
Right, in order to fill in that gap. And if the enterprise of DOGE and the Trump administration is to cut back on spending, it would seem that your concern is perhaps a real one. Other thoughts?
So let's take a step back here. The Department of Education was created by an act of Congress which spells out certain things that it needs to do. So I think I worry a little bit that we're entering into a mindset where, well, the Trump administration has eliminated this department or gutted this department or, canceled this by executive order, so we just sort of act like it wouldn't be illegal for him to just do this and eliminate the Department of Education simply because he said during the campaign that he planned to. It's going to take an act of Congress to do this. Now, I think Tara's absolutely right that the big question here is what's happening with the funding. Fundamentally, the Department of Education is about protecting civil rights for students with disabilities, ensuring IEPs. It also has a specific charge to administer student loans. So there's a lot that's going on here. And if it's not carefully thought out what the changes are going to be in the Department of Education, and if it's, as it seems from the initial memos and the final mission email, that the thought about affecting the Department of Education in this way is really about continuing to go after DEI and things like that, I think that we're going to run into a whole lot of chaos that's going to be really felt in these schools, even if the department still exists in name. If all of that funding is cut without an act of Congress, we're going to have a lot of hurt in our schools, and it's going to be really more chaos and more intensity for students who really need that support.
Yeah, well, it seems like it's going to happen, right? And this, I think part of the conversation around this nationally has been that folks are talking as if this is a new thing. From the moment that the Department of Education was put in place in 1980, Republicans started talking about getting rid of it back then. Reagan really moved forward to do so, but he was facing a Democratic-controlled Congress and wasn't able to. And then as late as 1996, so there's nothing new here. And so the argument, Aaron, is to get rid of it so that states can now take over what many of them see as something that falls within the state's purview. So you were talking about funding, and yeah.
Well, you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say, oh, it's states' rights, we're just going to let the states do this, and then issue these directives that say, if any schools in any way touch on diversity in education, in any way, they are violating the law, right? You can't have states' rights both ways, and that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. I totally get your point. Many Republican presidential candidates have said, look, education should be a states issue, but what we're seeing right now is not an elimination of the Department of Education with a big plan to return that funding and all the administration to the states. What we're seeing is we think that this is a way to go after wokeness one more time. That's what's coming out of the Trump administration.
And it can't be done without an act of Congress. The Department of Education Organization Act specifies 11 offices that have to be housed in the Department of Education. And you can't eliminate them without an act of Congress doing that. Now, as Aaron mentioned, you can change the allocation. You can lay off massive amounts of people. That'll be significant. But I agree, the rhetoric has been there. This is an escalation of that. I don't see it happening in the short term. And I don't think most people appreciate how impactful the Department of Education is. To Tara's point, Every child gets a free breakfast and a free lunch who lives in Onondaga County, Oneida County, and every other surrounding county. That is paid for by the federal government. We haven't even mentioned higher education, right? How the vast majority of students pay for higher education, it goes through the Department of Education, who subsidizes a lot of college tuition in the public interest. So the ramifications are enormous. So I don't think we should underestimate the importance of this. I think it's going to be very difficult to implement in the short term in terms of what Trump wants to do.
As an elected school board member, Luke, if I could follow up and ask also about, in addition to the stuff that you just mentioned, there are the losses from COVID, right? The fact that there's still excessive absenteeism, low reading scores. So how does your school board anticipate, were this to happen, to anticipate dealing with those?
So each school board is going to evaluate how much federal money they have. Bigger districts with more low-income students, like Utica, for instance, get most of their funding through the federal government. So major changes to that will be catastrophic because they don't have the revenue to make it up. Other school districts, they're trying to deal with COVID learning loss, and they're also trying to deal with mental health. And the mental health piece costs money in terms of getting more staff to help students with that.
Yeah, and great points. To follow up on Luke's point about post-secondary education, one of the points that's made, and she says what Trump's administration is saying, disruption leads to innovation and gets results. I'm proud to work for a university that's been proactive in this and looking at STEM and having applied degrees where they can pair it with a dual degree and get real job experience while they're getting their education. And that's what they're pushing. We get very distracted with the DEI component of this. It gets so much attention in the media, but they do have some good points that are outlined in this as well.
Yeah, I agree, Ben. It seems that there are any number of goals involved here, and so seeing how they come down will be significant for assessing the impact.